All right, why don't we get started? Welcome to LaRouche PAC's regular Saturday night class series. I'm Susan Kokinda, and tonight Bob Ingram is going to continue the really groundbreaking series of classes that he's been doing, looking at the founding of our nation through the actions of really the very underestimated George Washington. While he's revered as the father of our country, at least he used to be before our education system went woke, even when he was venerated, I think the full depth of his genius, the significance of the unique contributions he made militarily, politically, and otherwise, is something which is certainly has been a revelation to me, and I suspect is a revelation to many people who have participated in the first parts of this class series. Today is November 5th. We are a little over 72 hours away from the polls closing in the midterm elections throughout the United States. I think we're going to find ourselves in a very different world. I would not presume to forecast what that world will look like, but I think we're going to be in a very different world as a result of this midterm election, because what we've been identifying is that this is not merely an election. The form is an election, but really what we're in the middle of is a point of inflection in what some of my colleagues have called the Third American Revolution. The second, of course, is something that Bob has also discussed in great detail, and that was Abraham Lincoln's rescuing of our republic by reviving the profound principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and creating a new Republican Party. That process, especially the question of creating a new Republican Party, is very, very much what is going on in the United States today. And we have much to say about that on our website. But of course, the first American Revolution is the subject of Bob's series of classes. And I have to say that the last two classes that he did before we took a couple of weeks break in the Washington series, the last two that he did really struck me in terms of a deeper understanding and appreciation of Washington actually as a scientist, as an agricultural scientist, as an innovator, both in agriculture and in industrial processes. And of course, that his perhaps most important collaborator in the fight for the Constitutional Convention and the creating of the Constitution was the premier scientist in the United States, and perhaps one of the premier scientists in the world, which was Benjamin Franklin. And it really hit me that we could not have created our republic had the leading figures involved in it not only been philosophers and statesmen who had studied forms of government, studied what had failed and what had worked at least in embryo in the past, but it would not have succeeded if you had not had people who had that kind of scientific bent. I think too much of the discussion of the principles of our Constitution, of our government, and so on, falls too much in the category of looking at the structures or looking at the relationship of government to constituencies or to people or to foreign nations in terms of foreign policy. But as Lyndon LaRouche stressed on more than one occasion, the most important role of government is of a state and government is to mediate the relationship of the nation to the physical universe. These are the fundamental questions of science. This is where economics finds its foundation and its grounding. And it's only by bringing that aspect of the creation of our nation and understanding of that aspect of it, are we going to find the tools that we're going to need as we come out of this midterm election and go into what is going to be extremely turbulent. It's going to be turbulent politically, but it's going to be even more turbulent economically, as we are continually reminded at an accelerating rate that the British Empire, the global elite, they have taken an axe to the physical ability of this nation to produce. They're going after our food. They're going after our energy. They're going after our clean water with their central banking policies, with their green policies, with all of their insanities. And they have already done tremendous damage. Simply getting them to stop is not going to be enough. We're going to have to become, as Washington was, as Hamilton was, as Lyndon LaRouche was, scientists of the physical economy, if we're going to forge the kinds of policies that we need to rescue the nation in the near term. So I think this series of classes, which Bob is embarking on tonight, I think he plans on doing 5 classes on the Washington presidency itself, is of utmost importance at this great moment in our own nation's history. So let me turn it over to Bob and get him spotlighted. All right, Bob.
Okay. Hi, folks. I'm happy you're with us tonight. So, yeah, I mean, look, the election is 3 days away. Everyone is getting nervous for good reason. But as Susan said, you know, after this election, we are going to be in an entirely new world, really, politically and in many other ways, regardless of the outcome. Now, you know, let's take a hypothesis, which is that the Republicans take back control of both houses of the Congress, right? Which is, I think, what everyone on this call wants to see happen. Um, and you know, and that this is where we find ourselves after the election, and you know, all of these people will be sworn in January, I guess. Now that will be a happy development, and obviously we can expect, you know, certain things to happen as a result of that, you know, which are fairly obvious. Efforts to build the wall, efforts to investigate, you know, Hunter Biden's laptop and other things more serious than that. Um, but, you know, the real question is, you know, outside of some of the obvious hot button issues, we're in an enormous crisis. We're in an enormous economic crisis. I mean, look, everyone knows it, and it's going to get much worse, not better. Um, I mean, in the near term, we're facing the possibility, not certainty, but possibility of a nationwide truckers' strike. We're facing the possibility of a West Coast longshoreman strike, shipping port, you know, shutting down all the ports. Um, you know, the businesses are shutting down everywhere. Inflation is out of control. I mean, look, you know, I went into a grocery store the other day, and this was not some, you know, whoop-de-doo gourmet grocery store. It was just a, you know, a chain grocery store for working people, and I had to pay $5 for a dozen eggs. I mean, you know, I was like shocked. Um, but you know, that is where we are, and it's going to get worse. Um, you know, it's a crisis which is threatening the livelihood of every person in this country, you know, except for maybe the top 1 or 2% of the income brackets. It's a crisis which is imperiling the very future of families in this country, of young people in this country, of senior citizens in this country. And the question to ask yourself is, if this new Republican Congress comes into being, and once they are sworn in, what are they going to do about this? What principles and what policies are going to guide their actions? I mean, it's one thing to just say, Biden is bad. We don't want drag queens in the schools. We don't want sex education for 5-year-olds. Okay, that's a given. But in terms of the total destruction of our productive economy upon which we all depend, upon which our future depends, what are the policies and principles that the new Republican majority must act on to turn this situation around? And I can tell you, um, despite the fact that there are many good people in the Republican caucus, they really don't know what to do. They really don't. Some people have some good initiatives, some good policies, but overall, in terms of the magnitude of this crisis, they don't know what to do. And I want to read you a quote, very short quote from Lyndon LaRouche in a speech that he gave in May of 2016. I'm not sure where this speech was given or even the name of it, but I know that this is a accurate quote. And in that speech, LaRouche said, quote, "Mankind is not a bunch of objects that you can manipulate and make the toys dance for you. That does not work. You have to actually create a power in mankind which is improved over previously existing expressions of mankind. That is the whole game. And you have to spread this kind of development such that it sustains itself. The desire is not to win. The desire is to create and to do nothing that does not allow you to create." Now, this class is actually, the next several classes are going to be on the third phase of the American Revolution, which is the Washington presidency. By 1789, the first two phases had been successfully completed: the military victory over the British Empire, and then the securing and ratification of the United States Constitution. When George Washington was sworn into office in April of 1789, this began the third phase of the revolution. And I think you have to really look at this the way, based on the words I just read to you from Lyndon LaRouche, where he says, you have to create a power in mankind which is improved over previously existing expressions of mankind. That is the whole game, and that such that it sustains itself. The desire is not to win, the desire is to create. Now, the story of the Washington presidency is really the story of the Washington-Hamilton alliance. Prior to this, during the Revolutionary War, and then even in the period leading up to the Constitution, although it was less so there, you could view Hamilton as the protege of Washington, the young man that Washington took under his wing. Remember, in 1776, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, and when Hamilton is, running this artillery unit in New York City, Hamilton was only 19 years old. And Washington took him under his wing, and Washington nourished him and sponsored him. By the time you get to the Washington presidency, although Washington is commander in chief, Washington is the leader, the president, what you really begin to see is an extraordinary partnership, which is, in depth, um, where the two men are functioning based on the same intention, the same, actions, the same principles that they are acting upon. And what they are determined to do is what I just read to you twice from Lyndon LaRouche, which is to create. That now that the Constitution is on paper, a government has been elected. Um, the what you see in the Washington administration is the determination to create the republic, and it is very much focused on economic policy. And this is, the way you have got to understand this third phase of the American Revolution. And I think myself that this is of paramount importance in thinking about what our job is going to be as we move past the election, what our job is going to be, what our role is going to be, as the new Congress is sworn in January. We have to show people, we have to insist that the economic principles which created the nation, literally created the nation and secured the nation during the Washington presidency, are what we return to get out of the mess that we're in right now. Now, as I said, I'm going to go through a lot of history. That was just sort of the warm up. But the Washington is sworn in 1789, April 1789. But I want to just touch on one thing, which is I want to go back 8 years earlier to 1781. This is prior to the Battle of Yorktown. The military fighting, the war is still going on. And at that time, the Articles of Confederation had just been adopted, creating a sort of loose confederation, sort of a type of government, to run the country. And in January of 1781, a man named General John Sullivan, who was a member of Washington's general staff, a man named General John Sullivan wrote a letter to George Washington. And in the letter, he proposed to Washington that Hamilton be made Secretary of Finance under the Articles of Confederation in 1781. Washington wrote a letter back to Sullivan. And in that letter, he said, quote, how far Colonel Hamilton, of whom you ask my opinion as a financier, has turned his thoughts to that particular study, I am unable to answer because I never entered upon a discussion of this post with him. But this I can venture to advance from a thorough knowledge of him, that there are few men to be found of his age who has a more general knowledge than he possesses, and none whose soul is more firmly engaged in the cause, or who exceeds him in probity and sterling virtue. Now, that same year that Washington had this exchange with Sullivan, that same year in 1781, Hamilton himself undertook three initiatives, three actions that were to, and everything that followed really flowed from these actions of Hamilton. First of all, on April 30th, he authored a lengthy essay, which he then sent as a letter to Robert Morris, the head of the Bank of North America in Philadelphia. And in that letter to Morris, Hamilton proposed the creation of a national bank and the creation of a national credit system to finance economic development. That was number one. Number two, in the, I think, the summer or autumn of 1781, he delivered a proposal, a written proposal, to the New York State Legislature, calling upon New York State to convene, or to send out an invitation to convene a national convention with the purpose of replacing the Articles of Confederation and creating a sovereign, centralized republic. So this is 7 years before the Constitutional Convention, 6 years before the Annapolis Convention. And here you have Washington proposing to the New York legislature that they issue a call for precisely such, essentially, a constitutional convention. And then in August of 1781, Hamilton authored and published 6 essays, which are called the Continentalist Essays, in which he argued for both the creation of a strong national government and the creation of a national bank. So this is his vision of what needed to be done. And in Continentalist number 6, I'll read you one paragraph from Continentalist number 6. Excuse me. Hamilton says, "There is something noble and magnificent in the perspective of a great federal republic closely linked to the pursuit of a common interest, tranquil and prosperous at home, respectable abroad. But there is something proportionally diminutive and contemptible in the prospect of a number of petty states with the appearance only of union, jarring, jealous, and perverse, without any determined direction, fluctuating and unhappy at home, weak and insignificant by their dissensions in the eyes of other nations. Happy America, if those to whom thou hast entrusted the guardianship of thy infancy know how to provide for thy future repose, but miserable and undone if their negligence or ignorance permits the spirit of discord to erect her banner on the ruins of thy tranquility." So that's just a short excerpt, and the Continentalist essays are readily available online. But this is Hamilton, writing letters to Morris, introducing resolutions into the New York not Morris, this is Hamilton, writing letters to Robert Morris, introducing resolution in the New York legislature, writing and publishing, the 6 Continentalist essays, all in the spring and summer of 1781, basically laying out, the sovereign republic that needed to be created and the principles that would govern that republic. So, this brings you to 1789, and where Washington comes in. He appoints Hamilton as the Treasury Secretary, and then the two of them together, act to bring into existence exactly the type of republic and a nation based on economic development and scientific progress, which Hamilton had been calling for, 8 years earlier in 1781. Now, to remind you, I went through this in an earlier class, but in 17, I want to give you before we actually go into the policies of the Washington administration, you've got to situate this, right? First of all, as I went through in an earlier class, in 1789, the United States was bankrupt. Close to $80 million in debt, no money in the treasury, no money. There was no U.S. currency in 1787, 88, 89. No U.S. currency. We were using British pounds and other European currency to conduct our business. Our trade was being controlled entirely by Britain, more so than even before the Revolution. We were being recolonized economically by the British Empire. Now, this leads to, the role of a man named Lord Shelburne, which some people have heard of. For some people, it's not a familiar name. But, his full name was William Petty Fitzmaurice, the first Marquis of Lansdowne and the Earl of Shelburne, but he's generally referred to as Lord Shelburne. He was a, high-flying, top-level British aristocrat. He had been the chairman of the of what was called the Secret Committee, which was the three-man committee that ran the British East India Company. He maintained his own intelligence service based out of his home, his estate. And I'm actually going to talk about him in a future class when we get to the question of the French Revolution, where he played a certain kind of role. But anyway, what happened was after the Battle of Yorktown, the government of Lord North, which had, run the British government during the Revolutionary War, after the, humiliating defeat of Cornwallis at Yorktown, Lord North resigned. He had been the prime minister throughout the war, but he resigned. And he was replaced by Lord Shelburne. Now, Lord Shelburne was a lot smarter than Lord North. And he immediately agreed to grant independence to the United States. And if you actually look at the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, one of the things which is quite surprising about it, at least it was very surprising to me when I studied it, is how generous the terms were that the British granted to the to the American delegation. Franklin had put forward his list of non-negotiable demands, and a typical kind of bargaining thing. And Franklin did not expect to get all of these demands, right? I don't know how many he expected to get, but he puts these forward as his maximum demands, right? And the British representative, by orders of Shelburne, agreed to every one of the demands except one, which is that Franklin had tacked on at the end that Britain had to surrender Canada to the United States. The British would not do that. But they gave Franklin everything else he wanted. Now, there were a lot of people in London who, particularly around the monarchy, who were not happy about this treaty at all. And on January 27th, 1783, Shelburne gave a speech on the floor of Parliament defending the Treaty of Paris. And I'll read you a section from that speech. He says, "You have given America, with whom every call under the heaven urges you to stand on the footing of brethren, a share in a trade, the monopoly of which you have sordidly preserved to yourselves. So he's accusing the British establishment of mistreating America. Monopolies, some way or other, are very justly punished. They forbid rivalry, and rivalry is of the very essence of well-being of trade. I avow that monopoly is always unwise, but if there is any nation under heaven which ought to be the first to reject monopoly, it is the English. Situated as we are between the old world and the new, and between southern and northern Europe, all we ought to covet on earth is free trade. With more industry, with more capital, with more enterprise than any other nation on earth, it ought to be our constant cry, let every market be open. So this was the strategy. The strategy was to grant the American colonies, which the British knew they just could no longer rule, to grant the American colonies political independence, but to reabsorb these American colonies or newly independent states into the British financial and economic empire. That was Shelburne's outlook. And it was Shelburne who commissioned Adam Smith to write The Wealth of Nations, which is where all these lunatic free trade people are just insane. They say, the American Revolution is based on the ideas of the wealth of nation. Adam Smith was an employee of the British East India Company. And there was a famous meeting between him and Shelburne, which is documented, in which Shelburne basically commissioned Adam Smith to write The Wealth of Nations, this Bible of free trade. The Wealth of Nations was not a document in support of the American Revolution. The Wealth of Nations was a prescription by Smith and Shelburne to control America after the Revolution, to make America totally subservient in every way imaginable to the City of London, to their banking policies, their currency policies, their trade policies, as I said, to essentially recolonize America or shift the form of colonization, into economic and financial control. And in fact, this is what the British later did in the 19th century when they started creating dominions, like the Dominion of Canada, where they granted them self-rule, but they remained as under the thumb of the British imperial financial system. So this was the outlook. Now the Hamilton in Federalist number 16, Federalist paper number 11, responded directly to this. And he said, the adventurous spirit of America has already excited uneasy sensations in several of the maritime powers of Europe. If we continue united, we may counteract a policy so unfriendly to our prosperity in a variety of ways. Suppose, for instance, we had a government in America capable of excluding Great Britain from all our ports. What would be the probable operation of this step upon her policies? Would it not enable us to negotiate with the fairest prospect of success for commercial privileges of the most valuable and extensive kind? And as for Washington in 1789, shortly after taking office, he said, my endeavors shall be unremittingly exerted, even at the hazard of former fame or present popularity, to extricate my country from the embarrassments in which it is entangled through want of credit. So, what you have is, um, I mean, there's sort of this myth, or I don't know what you want to call it. People say, certainly Jefferson and Madison said this, that, Hamilton was this evil genie, and Washington was just sort of duped by him. That Washington wasn't all that bright, and Hamilton just sort of controlled him. But, as you go through this, there is no question that Washington was every much of an economic nationalist as Hamilton. That as you get into 1790, 1791, national banking and many other policies, Hamilton and Washington are operating as partners. And one of the ways the history books and biographers misrepresent this is they say there was this cabinet rivalry with Washington caught in the middle, this rivalry between Jefferson and Hamilton. Now, that's really not true at all. And really, it's fraudulent, because if you study it carefully, that is clearly not the right characterization of it. On every single major issue of economic policy, every single issue that came up during the Washington presidency, Washington backed Hamilton. Washington and Hamilton were acting with one intention in terms of a sovereign republic, national banking, economic development, science, trade, industry, internal improvements, etc. The development of the nation. And it was not Jefferson versus Hamilton. It was Jefferson and Madison versus Washington and Hamilton. That's the actual dynamic, and that's irrefutable for anyone who goes beyond, what they read on Wikipedia and actually studies what was going on during that period. So let's get into this a little bit. Between January of 1790 and December of 1791, Hamilton wrote 4 reports, which created the, American system of sovereign public credit. First was the report on public credit. Then was the second report on public credit, which is usually called the report on the National Bank. Then there was the report on the establishment of a mint. And then there was the report on manufacturers. These were all written within a 24-month period. This created the sovereign American economic system. Then a couple months later, he wrote something called The Opinion as to the Constitutionality of the Bank of the United States. And if you take these 5 writings as a whole, they are absolutely unified in what they say. I mean, they're dealing with different subjects, but they're unified in their intention, in what they are determined to implement, which is an economic system, a unified policy of rapid economic development, increased national productivity, scientific breakthroughs, the transformation of the skills and cognitive development of the population, upward human progress, physical human progress. This is what they're all designed to create. And the problem when people discuss Hamilton today is they want to deal with this as if these are financial policies. But the establishment of the credit system was merely the means towards the end. The end was the development of the nation, the upward productive development of the nation and of the people of the nation. And this was the completion of the revolution that had been initiated in 1775 at Lexington and Concord. Now, I'll just say a few things about the Bank of the United States. I'm not going to go into detail about a lot of the financial side of this, but I just want to say a few things about the Bank of the United States. for those who think otherwise, the Bank of the United States was absolutely not a central bank. For example, it did not set monetary policy. It did not regulate private banks. It did not act as the lender of last resort. It was forbidden to buy government bonds or otherwise fund permanent government debt. It could neither issue notes nor incur debts beyond its actual capitalization. Foreigners could buy stock in the bank, but were not allowed to be voting members. They had no vote. They were what called passive stockholders. There was a mandatory rotation of directors, and the Secretary of the Treasury was empowered to remove government deposits, to inspect the bank's books, and to require statements regarding the bank's condition as frequently as once a week. That is, once every week, the Treasury could demand these accountings from the bank. So this was a bank that operated under strict government supervision, was partially capitalized by the national government, and which was not allowed to do almost all of the things that a central bank does today. It was under strict supervision. It was created by the U.S. Congress, and it was under strict supervision of the U.S. Congress. As Hamilton stressed repeatedly, and I do mean this repeatedly, I'm not just saying it for emphasis. He said it for emphasis. He says it in the report on the National Bank, and he says it again in the report on manufacturers, that the overriding primary purpose of the National Bank was to issue loans into the productive economy, into farms, into businesses, into manufacturing, into trade. It was to act as a means of generating credit to advance the productive economy. That was the purpose and the mandate of the National Bank. Now, you certainly cannot say that about the Federal Reserve today. The bank was located in Philadelphia, but it had 4 branches initially, one in Boston, one in New York, one in Charleston, and one in Baltimore. And then within a few years, it created 4 more branches in Washington, D.C., Norfolk, Virginia, Savannah, Georgia, and New Orleans. So, within a few years of its opening its doors, there were the main bank in Philadelphia plus 8 branch banks situated in every geographical region in the country. And the idea was to create a flow of credit through these banks into the local economies, to build them up and to build up, the productive power of the nation. Other banks could exist. I mean, there was no law against private banks. Private banks existed when the Bank of the United States was created. But private banks, which are state chartered, not federally chartered, private banks were only allowed to operate within the state in which they were chartered. Only the Bank of the United States could operate nationwide. Now, Hamilton then goes on to the next step, which is the report on manufacturers. And I mentioned this, I read you that little quote from LaRouche from his speech on May 10th. I'll read to you another short quote from that speech, where LaRouche says, "It is the development of the individual within the nation that is the key to power. The ability to create something better than mankind has known and experienced beforehand." Now, I'll read that again. It is the development of the individual within the nation that is the key to power. The development of the individual within the nation. The ability to create something better than mankind has known and experienced beforehand. Now, in essence, what LaRouche says in that short little excerpt is precisely the subject of Hamilton's report on manufacturers. This is a report in which he, puts forward the argument that the scientific, manufacturing, technological, and industrial development of the nation is in a very real way the essence of the republic itself. Because what you are creating is a nation which is governed by the principle of creating something better than what had existed beforehand, of advancing the nation, to a higher level of creativity, of productivity, of economic power, all of which creates the conditions for the people, the citizenry, to advance, for their children and grandchildren to advance to higher levels. And this is the subject of the report on manufacturers. Hamilton in the report calls for creating something he calls the Society for Establishing Useful Manufacturers. He proposes a national system of what he calls bounties. I've covered some of this in earlier classes, but bounties would be direct government payments or sponsorship, not like Biden's welfare checks he sends out, but bounties to inventors, to scientists, to people who are trying to develop new technologies, new manufacturing techniques that these people could apply to the government for aid. And if what they were doing was deemed worthy, important for the national interest, the government would sponsor this kind of research, this kind of scientific investigation. This was all viciously attacked by Jefferson and by Madison and by their other flunky, James Monroe. One thing that people are not aware of, a lot of people know that, Jefferson strongly opposed Hamilton on the national bank. But in fact, Jefferson and Madison were far more freaked out about the report on manufacturers than they were about the report on the national bank. In fact, Jefferson, in response to the national bank, Jefferson wrote a memo which he circulated to everyone in the government called Notes on the Constitutionality of Bounties to Encourage Manufacturers, where he directly attacks this proposal for bounties, this proposal for supporting science and inventions and technology. He says this is unconstitutional. The government has no authority to do this, blah, blah, blah. Jefferson also, Madison at the same time wrote a letter, I'm not sure if it was to Jefferson or to someone else, where he again just loses his mind with these incredible attacks on the report of manufacturers. And he says, quote, "What do you think of Hamilton's commentary on the terms general welfare? This broaches a new constitutional doctrine of vast consequence. If Congress can do whatever is in their discretion to promote the general welfare, then the government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers." So this couldn't be more clear, this fight, Hamilton had based his, in his opinion on the constitutionality of the national bank, he had based his argument in support of the national bank, the government's power to create a national bank, on the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. And the report on manufacturers, he based his argument, and this is in the report, which is what Madison flips out about. He bases his argument in the report on manufacturers on the general welfare clause of the Constitution. So his argument is that to create a sovereign republic, one which will not, be recolonized financially and economically by the British, and one that will have sovereign power to develop and advance the productive power of the country in the way that he's proposing, that this is all, power given to the government to do these things under the necessary and proper clause and the general welfare clause. And in that argument, Washington agreed entirely, 100% with Hamilton. Jefferson and Madison said, no, no, no. The government can't do any of these things, and of course they were happy the way things were because they could just go back to their plantations and whip slaves and have sex with slaves and, make their money from selling cotton, but, they directly attacked this power. Now, the government did a lot of things under Washington. They built lighthouses, which again, there is no enumerated power in the Constitution for the government to build lighthouses, but they did it, which was an enormous boon. They created the U.S. Merchant Marine and the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard was not originally created as a military force. It was created to collect tariffs, to service the lighthouses, and they created both of those things, which in the Constitution, there's no enumerated power to do that. They implemented tariffs. There was the tariff of 1789. This was then expanded by the tariff of 1790. They gave, to create a merchant marine, they gave great benefits, economic benefits, whatever you want to call them, to reduced rates and what have you, to American flag vessels, such that the amount of goods being carried in foreign trade by American vessels, registered in the United States, flying the American flag, the amount of goods being carried by those vessels increased 400% during the Washington presidency. There's many other things they could do. And through these policies, through the tariffs, through the trade policies, through the excise taxes, through the functioning of the national bank, they began to reduce the national debt. And that would take a long discussion to go into. But when Washington took office, the government was $78 million in debt. It had no money. It was a staggering amount for those years. And there's this slander that Hamilton wanted to keep the country in debt, forever, so that the bankers would control things. And this is just, again, only someone who's a complete ignoramus could say something like that, because, factually, the evidence is clear. Hamilton began reducing the debt immediately, largely using the funds from the tariffs and the excise taxes. And while he was reducing the debt, with the establishment of the mint, the minting of actual sovereign American coins, and then the flow of credit through the national bank, you began to get a circulation of actual legitimate U.S. currency through the United States going into productive investment. Well, I'm going to skip some things. I was going to go into, because the Washington presidency is so extraordinary. I was going to go into the establishment of the federal judiciary, the establishment of the executive branch, because, bear in mind that, what Madison wanted, what the Virginia Plan proposed, was essentially a parliamentary government. People could argue about that, but really, if you're honest, that's what it was. A figurehead presidency, an almost non-existent judiciary, and 90% of all the power lying in Congress, and and under the 3/5 clause, the South would control House of Representatives. Washington passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the Supreme Court. Other actions were taken. And there were a number of things about in terms of the executive branch. One of which was when Washington issued his proclamation of neutrality, his neutrality proclamation, saying we were not going to take sides in the war between England and France in 1794. Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe all stated that this was unconstitutional, that Washington had no authority to do this, that such power lied entirely in Congress. And Hamilton authored a writing which was published entitled Defense of the President's Neutrality Proclamation, in which he ripped Jefferson and Madison and Monroe to shreds. So just to sort of return to sort of wrap it up, I mean, there's just so much more I could say, but I want to have discussion. So to get back to the question of the national bank, just briefly, after Hamilton issued his report on the national bank, Jefferson, Madison, and Edmund Randolph, who was the Secretary of State, I believe, who was a buddy of Jefferson's, all three from Virginia, they all wrote separate briefs, which they sent to Washington, separate arguments, declaring that the national bank was unconstitutional, that Congress, that it was not in the enumerated powers. They actually argued, as you hear people argue today, that under the 10th Amendment, that the federal, since the federal government had no such power to create a national bank, that this was something that was, the creation of banks was reserved under the 10th Amendment to the states. And Hamilton wrote back with his opinion on the constitutionality of the national bank, sent it to Washington. And the day after Washington read Hamilton's report on the constitution of the national bank, Hamilton signed the legislation into law. This was Madison and Jefferson versus Hamilton and Washington. Now, what I'm going to end with, and I really feel like I just scratched the surface. Maybe people have some good questions, but I want to end with, and I'm going to read to you again something. It's a little bit longer, but Hamilton's constitutionality on the opinion, Hamilton's opinion on the constitutionality of the national bank. I want to read to you a couple of excerpts out of that opinion. He says, it ought to be premised that the objections of the Secretary of State and Attorney General are founded on a general denial of the authority of the United States to erect corporations. The latter, that is Randolph, expressly admits that if there be anything in the bill which is not warranted by the Constitution, it is the clause of incorporation, because the bank would be an incorporated entity. And Hamilton continues, now it appears to the Secretary of the Treasury that this general principle of incorporation is inherent in the very definition of government and essential to every step of the progress to be made by that of the United States, namely, that every power vested in a government is in its nature sovereign and includes, by the force of the term, a right to employ all the means requisite and fairly applicable to the attainment of the ends of such power, and which are not precluded by restrictions and exceptions specified in the Constitution, or not immoral, or not contrary to the Constitution or to the essential ends of political society. And then he goes on, he discusses the necessary and proper clause, and he goes into a discussion of sort of defining the term necessary. He says the degree in which a measure is necessary, can never be a test of the legal right to adopt it. That must be a matter of opinion. That is, the degree of necessity is a matter of opinion. And the only test, the relation between the measure and the end, between the nature of the means employed towards the execution of power and the object of that power, must be the criterion of constitutionality, not the more or less of necessity or utility. The practice of the government is against the rule of construction advocated by the Secretary of State, Jefferson. The act concerning lighthouses, beacons, buoys, and public piers is a decisive example. This doubtless must be referred to the powers of regulating trade and is fairly relative to it. But it cannot be affirmed that the exercise of that power in this instance was strictly necessary, or that the power itself would be nugatory without that of regulating establishments of this nature. This restrictive interpretation of the word necessary is also contrary to this sound maxim of construction, namely, that the powers contained in a constitution of government, especially those which concern the general administration of the affairs of a country, its finances, its trade, its defense, ought to be construed liberally in advancement of the public good. So, that's really all I want to go through. But, what you see here is, beginning, obviously, it goes back even earlier. It goes back, if you're looking at what Hamilton is doing, what Washington is doing as a scientist, as a farmer, with infrastructure, with the Potomac Company. If you look at all of Franklin's works, if you look at what Hamilton is saying here, what he was saying in 1781 even, the creation of a nation which is independent, which is sovereign, as I said from LaRouche, which is now turning its attention to creation, the advancement, development, a nation which will be powerful enough economically and sovereign enough in its own financial affairs to resist the imperial ambition of the City of London and the British Empire, which will be able to create its own sovereign, productive, economic system. This is what Hamilton and Washington together brought into existence during the Washington presidency. This was the completion of the revolution, the creation of a republic, the likes of which had never before been seen in human history. So, there's a lot more that could be said, but let's end right there. And this will give us plenty of time for questions and discussion. Okay?
All right.